Hey, it's John at Tinderbox Arts. So I'm getting my R1200RT ready for a trip. This is a bike that I normally use for longer trips and for winter riding. Otherwise, I have my other bike here that I use for around town. So in this bike, I want to make sure everything is good to go for the trip because I don't use this bike every day, and if there is something wrong, I don't want it sneaking up on me in the middle of a trip. So one of the things that I'm doing today is to replace the seals and the bearings in the front wheel here. They're not bad right now. There was a little bit of whining on my last trip, so they may be approaching the point where they're going to need to be replaced, but at the moment they're functional. However, the bearings and the seals are very inexpensive if you're buying them third party, so I might as well do that now just to make sure there's no problems. So now before I can show you how to replace the seals and the bearings, we need to get this wheel off, obviously. Now to do that, it's pretty simple, but very briefly, you put the bike up on the center stand, you're going to lift from the engine. I have a video showing how to do that, and that will get the front wheel off the ground. At that point, we're going to remove both of these brake calipers, tie them up out of the way, and we will loosen over here on this side, this set bolt right here, and get the axle out, and we can drop the wheel. There is one little gotcha, which is that very often there's not enough clearance underneath the wheel to get it out from under this little area right here, this bodywork right here. So you have two choices. One is you can remove this bodywork and get that out of the way, or sometimes if you're doing other work on the bike anyway, you might have the rear wheel off, in which case you can pivot the bike more dramatically, and that will give you room under the front wheel here to drop it. But one way or the other, you just need to make room under the wheel so you can drop it down out of the way once you remove the axle. All right, I got the wheel out. If you need to remove this little nose here, you may not, but if you do, it looks like this, and there are just some screws right here, same on the other side, and then a little plastic tab that fits in here. You could stick your finger up under there, release the tab, and then this little nose comes off. I actually probably did not need to remove it, but I want to clean it up anyway because on my last trip here, there's all sorts of dirt I just want to clean off. Now the wheel itself, there's a spacer on the left side as you're sitting on the motorcycle, and that's the same side as this tone ring or tone wheel for the wheel sensor. On the other side, there's nothing except for the seal and the bearing itself. Now you got to be very careful with these brake discs. You don't want to lay it flat because it will sit on the disc and you run the risk of bending the disc. So when I put this down flat on the ground, I want to make sure there's wood or something and it's resting on the tire or the wheel itself, not on the brake. This spacer will just come out very easily like that. All right, there's two seals that we'll need. On the left side or port side as you're sitting on the bike, the seal is a 35 by 52 by 7. On the right side, the seal is a 30 by 52 by 7, so they're two different sizes. Now these we'll just put aside. We'll also need bearings, of course, and these I'm going to put in the freezer. In other words, I want to get these as cold as I can, and that will help us install them. So I'm going to show you the part number here, then we'll put these in the freezer. The part number is a 6205-C-2HRS, and that's an FAG bearing, which is a good brand with an unfortunate name. Now I'm going to put these in the freezer so they get good and cold. In the process, they're going to shrink, and that will help us install them. All right, let's take a look at the seal and the bearing on this side. The opposite side is identical except for the size of the seal. So what we're looking at here is the inner race, it's called, and I can just stick my fingers in there and turn it back and forth. And what I want to do is feel for anything sticking, any grittiness. I don't really want to feel anything, but it's turning smoothly. Now this one is. I'll check the other side too. You know, this one's not as nice. There's no grittiness, but it's not turning super smoothly. In fact, I'm having some difficulty turning it at all. So this bearing might be on the way out. Now how are we going to remove these bearings? The way these work, if you've never done this before, a bearing is comprised of an inner race, which is this one right here, that metal you see right there, and an outer race. And in between the outer race and the inner race are the ball bearings themselves. This particular type of bearing has a seal, that black area, that plastic seal, which just helps keep the grease in. What happens is this is a press fit into the wheel. So the outer race is a press fit, meaning it's extremely tight and it's not going to move once it's installed there. So the reason I just took this out of the freezer, I'm going to put it back into the freezer. The reason we're putting it in the freezer is that we want this to shrink so that when I install this, it's easier to get into the wheel, because this will be a little bit smaller than it would be otherwise. Now, how do we get it out? Well, there's really only one way, and that is to somehow grab a hold of this inner race, and then we basically bang it out, because this outer race is pressing against the wheel, and we just need to push it out somehow. So we have to grab this inner race. That's really the only place we have to grab it. So how do we do that? Well, one of my favorite methods is one that I cannot use on the RT, and that's because the inner race is just too big. It's about 25 millimeters. But I'll just mention this method, which is to use a concrete anchor. This is used in construction, and what would normally happen in construction is you drill a hole the right size for this anchor. You push this into the hole, and there's a bolt at the top. When you tighten that bolt, it squeezes these sleeves right here, and this one on the bottom expands. When it expands, that ends up pressing against the concrete, and this anchor can't come out. So if I use this for the wheel, what I do is I put this section right here to the inner race of the bearing. I tighten this bolt right here. This starts to expand and press against the inner race, and that really gives you a solid purchase. Then once I've got that solid purchase, I can just take a hammer and a drift and just bang on this end here, and it'll push the whole bearing out, because this is, solid against that inner race, and the outer race has to follow the inner race. So that's a method I really like to use, but they don't make them big enough for the particular bearing the RT has. So I can't use that here. Now, another option are to use bearing pullers. I have a couple different sets. This is one example. And the way these work is, again, there's kind of an expanding sleeve. So to use this style, you pick the expanding sleeve that's appropriate size for the bearing. And you can see there's some slots right here, right? One there, one there, one there. And when you install this, a pin, I'll call it, in here, and you start to screw that in place, that pin presses against the inside of this sleeve right here, and it starts to expand. When it does, it will expand against the inner race like we talked about earlier. And if you just keep cranking down on this, eventually you get to the point where it's solid and tight. And again, you'll just take a drift on the other side with a hammer and bang out that bearing, because again, the inner race will follow the outer race. Now, the reason this is called a puller is because they also make an assembly here that you can use a slide hammer or something like that to pull a bearing out. But for the size of bearings that we're talking about here, that generally doesn't work. Generally, you need a mallet and a drift to bang it out. So this is definitely an option. And this last option is something that's new to me. It's made by a company called Motion Pro. What they do is they give you an adapter which is sized for the bearing, in this case 25 millimeter. And this is really just a hunk of metal with this area right here has a slot. So this rounded area right here is inserted into the inner race, and then there's a driver here with a wedge on the end. When you push that wedge in, basically you can expand that collar so that it wedges against the inner race, and then you have this driver here to whack with a hammer from the other side. So in theory it should work pretty good. There is one little catch though, and that is you need to put this end of the adapter onto something solid when you first start wedging in here. Otherwise, you're just going to push it right out. So if I put that on something solid, wedge this driver into that slot until it expands, then I'll remove whatever's underneath this so that it gives some space, and then I can just whack on this driver and push the whole bearing out. So I think I'm going to try this first because I haven't tried it yet. But if that does fail, I can always fall back on my old favorite. All right, I'm going to pop this seal out first, and I got to be careful not to scratch the outside here. So that just pops right out very easily. There is some grease in there, and that exposes the bearing. In fact, let me just clean out the grease from here, and I can give you a better idea what it looks like if you haven't seen this before. So there's the outer race right there, and it's a press fit against the aluminum hub there. There's the inner race. And actually, in between these two bearings is another spacer, which connects with the inner race, by the way. Okay, so that's exposed. I'll flip the wheel over and do the other side as well. So it doesn't matter which side you do first. I'll probably do the one that's facing down now. And what I need to do is get this adapter in there to the inner race, support the bottom of this while I'm using the wedge, right? Once I've expanded the collar, then I'll take the support out from underneath here so that it's free floating underneath, and then just whack that thing and it should come out. One other thing you want to do is to heat up around the bearing. So in other words, the aluminum hub here, we want to heat that up. There's a few ways you can do that. A guy named Steve Campbell in the UK, what he does is put a rag around this and put boiling water in the rag, and that holds the heat in. I'm in a kind of a closed garage here, so I don't really want water everywhere. The other option is you can use a torch just to heat this up, just briefly. You don't have to kill it. Or a heat gun, same idea, an electric heat gun. You just want to heat this up. It doesn't need to be cherry red or anything like that. You just want to heat it up a little bit so it expands, and that will make the bearing come out a little bit easier. All right, I found a socket that I think will work, so I'm going to put the socket on the floor like that. This adapter will go like that, and that will raise that adapter up so that it's the highest point. If I put this in here like so, slide it in. And now you can see the wheel is floating. Now I can take this wedge, find the slot. I want to get in the middle there. There it is. And I'm just going to take a sledgehammer and whack it until it expands enough that I think it's going to hold. All right, that's pretty good. I don't think that's going anymore. Now I'll lift the tire back up, get rid of this, put it back on my blocks here. Now I have space, and I should be able to just hit the end of this and drive that whole bearing out. Before I do it though, I'm going to grab a torch and I'm just going to heat up the hub here just a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to take just a propane torch here, and I really want to get the bottom, not the top, so I don't burn my fingers. I want to be careful of the paint. I don't want to hold it in one spot too long. All right, that's enough. Now I'm going to take this and we'll see what happens. I've never tried it. We'll see if this works. Sounds good. Wow, I think it came right out. Let me turn this over. And yeah, that's working very well. You can see the bearing is almost completely out. Hope you can see that. And this is the adapter. And now I'm just going to tap it a little bit more. And that's it. That worked quite well. Make sure that's not too hot. So yeah, I'm very pleased with that. Now, of course, you got to get this adapter out, but I don't think that'll be too much trouble. Now here's the spacer in between. I'll just pull that out. And this one's a little bit unusual. It has these, I don't know if they're seals or what you want to call them, but that fits in between the two inner races. So I'll just put that aside carefully. Here's a close-up of what just happened, right? So that tool fit to the inner race there, and this wedge area just expanded it, and that's the bearing out. Now, if we look at the hub, we want to look closely here. We want to make sure that this is not filthy, there's no corrosion in there. And make sure there's no physical damage. This looks very, very good. No problems at all. When I put this back together, I will put some grease on the inside there just to prevent corrosion. And always remember that that sleeve in the middle there, the spacer, needs to go back in before we, before we put the last bearing in. So now I have one more bearing there at the bottom, and I can use the same method. It should pop right out. All right, I got my setup there. Find the slot. Where is it? There it is. I'll make sure I'm in the middle and give this a whack. You can kind of feel it tighten up to the point where it's not going to expand anymore. Now let me get some heat on here. And I'll just remove that socket from underneath. Make sure I'm on the blocks. And I should be able to whack this right back out again. Wow, that works really, really well. Beautiful. You know, I'm very impressed with this tool. I think I'll be using this more often. All right, so here's one of the old bearings, and I want to make sure you understand something. We took this out by having that wedge against the inner race, and then I just whacked it out. That ruins the bearing. You can never use this again. When we install the new one, it's different. Now, we put the new one in the freezer, remember, which will help shrink this, and I can also apply heat to that hub again, so that will help, but it's a press fit on the outside. To install the new one, what we want to do is only bang on the outer race. We never want to touch the inner race when we're installing this, because that would ruin the bearing. So what we need to do is find a socket, or they do make special tools that are the exact diameter of the outside race, and we'll put that in the hub and just carefully whack that into place. Now, what if you don't have a socket that's exactly the right size? Very often you don't. In that case, you go slightly smaller and you'll just work around the edge here, but you need to have this bearing go in evenly. If it's cocked to one side, that's going to be a problem. All right, I found a socket. It's not perfect, but it's pretty darn close. Close enough. It's slightly smaller than the outer race, but that'll be fine. And if I need to, I can just kind of move it around like this. Now in the hub, you can see there's a machined area right here, an edge inside, and that's where the outer race of the bearing stops. So when you start to put this in, you will hear it and feel it when it hits that stop, and just end your banging right there. There's no need to go any farther. All right, so I have my inner sleeve or spacer ready, but I don't need to do that yet. I need to get this first bearing in. It really doesn't matter which side you choose. I'm just going to heat this up. I'm working alone, so I'm going to heat this up real quick, run into the freezer and get the bearing, and we'll drop it in. I just want to make sure I have all my stuff ready, my hammer, everything's good. And without touching that so I don't burn myself, we're just going to put that right like that. And we'll take our little socket here and just tap it in. There it is. All right, I can hear it hit home. I know that's good. No more. Now, I'm going to flip this over. Make sure I don't land on the brake rotor. Now, what do I got to do before I put the bearing in? I got to put that sleeve in. Don't forget this. So that's just going to go like that. And I'll make sure that's lined up. All right, that's lined up well. Get some of that extra grease out. Now, same thing. I will heat this up a little bit, get my other bearing, and we'll tap the other bearing in. And making sure I don't get burned. Get that started, and we'll just tap her in. Almost there. All right, we are good. All right, now we can install the seals. Before I do that, I want to check inside there. There's a retaining spring. You can kind of see that little metal in there. You want to make sure that spring, the retaining spring, is in good shape, is not bent or out of alignment or anything like that. Remember, there's a 35mm side which goes on the port side of the bike, and we could double check that because this spacer goes in there, and that's what this is. So this is the 35mm side, and it goes on the same side as the sensor and the tone ring. Now before I put the seal in, I really like to add some grease on the outside here. There is a seal to the bearing, however, water can still get in there, and this grease really just gives an extra sealing, really power, and stays underneath the seal, so it helps keep water out, and it will lubricate the seal itself, because remember that seal is riding on metal. So we just want to get a little bit of grease in there and make sure that's well protected. After I put the seal in, I will also lube up this area right here. So now, how do we get this seal installed? Well, just like the bearing, we only want to bang on the outside edge and not too hard at that. This is rubber, we don't want it to distort. Sometimes, quite honestly, you can just push it in with your fingers, and I may even try that here. Another option, again, is to use a socket of the right diameter of the outside. And another option yet is to use a seal driver, which is what this is, and it's designed to give you the right diameter on the outside and to push that seal in. Now, before I push this all the way in, I'm going to put a little grease on the back side here. And I want to do that because, again, I need the lubrication so it doesn't dig into the metal, and it will help protect against water intrusion. Now, I could take this right here, and honestly, I think I will try it with just my hands. Sometimes it works, sometimes not. Yeah, this one's going to be a little bit more particular, so I will use my seal driver. Now, you don't want to go too far. Just tap it in. It's not coming back out, so keep checking. It just goes to the edge of that hub. So I'm taking real little bites. That side's in. I gotta go this side a little more. Almost there. Good. That's it. So that's basically done. All I can do now is add a little bit more grease. I'll just shove it under there. And again, I want this, there's like a little cupped area for the seal, and you want some grease in that. It's like a double lip is what it is. And then we could put it back together. When I put this spacer in on this side, again, I'll put some grease there and some grease in here. And when I do the axle, I will grease up the axle. Even though it doesn't touch anything in the inside, I just want to protect against corrosion. Now that one I actually put in with my fingers without any problem. So really just depends on the seal probably, but that went super easy. I'll just put some more grease in here. Okay, we'll see if we can sneak this in here. Here's my spacer, I don't want to forget that. That fits in beautifully. While this is open, I think I'll clean off some of that grease. You don't want too much grease on the outside because then that'll attract dirt. Alright, and now this is tricky and kind of a pain when you're working alone. What you got to do is lift up the whole wheel and tire and then slide the axle in from the other side. So what I usually do is use my legs to get it in there. I have my axle ready. Okay, once I have the thread started, then I can work from the other side and get it tightened up. Now the other side is where you tighten the axle. There's a torque spec for that. Honestly, I don't know what it is off the top of my head. And then there's that set screw again. There's a torque spec for that. So I'm afraid I'd have to look those up. I don't know them off the top of my head. But that's basically it. We'll get this back together, get the calipers back on, bodywork back on, and then we'll give this wheel a spin before you let it down. Just make sure it spins freely and it feels right. No noises or anything like that. And then take it for a test ride. You're ready to go.